Barnes turned, his expression sharp. "Mind your business." The bystander didn't back down. "That's Judge Carter. Do you even know who you're messing with?" Barnes froze for a moment, the words sinking in. His gaze shifted back to Vanessa, suspicion giving way to doubt. "Judge," he muttered. Vanessa straightened up and met his gaze. "That's correct, Officer Barnes. I am Judge Vanessa Carter of the Milridge Municipal Court. And I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." For the first time, Barnes looked uncertain. He glanced around at the growing crowd, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of his control. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to back down entirely. "Well, Judge Carter," he said, his tone mocking, "if you're who you say you are, I'm sure you'll have no trouble explaining this to the department." With that, he placed her in handcuffs. The crowd gasped, and the phones recording the event captured every moment. Vanessa didn't resist, but the look in her eyes was one of quiet determination. As Barnes led her to his patrol car, she calmly said, "I hope you're prepared for the consequences of this, Officer Barnes. Because this isn't over." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Barnes's confidence began to waver. He shoved her into the back seat of the car and slammed the door shut. As he walked to the driver's seat, a voice in the crowd shouted, "This is going viral." And it did. By the time Barnes started the engine, the first videos had already been uploaded to social media. Within minutes, they began to gain traction, setting the stage for a firestorm that neither Vanessa nor Barnes could have anticipated. The town of Milridge had always been a place where the past lingered in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The cobblestone streets, old plantation-style homes, and whispers of history clung to the air like a heavy fog. For years, it had prided itself on being a peaceful community, but beneath the surface lay deep divides that simmered quietly, rarely boiling over into public view. Judge Vanessa Carter knew this all too well. She had spent her career navigating the complexities of justice in a town that wasn't always eager to embrace change. Vanessa's journey to becoming a judge was one of resilience and determination. Born and raised in Milridge, she had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about the civil rights movement and the struggles her family faced just to live with dignity. Her parents had instilled in her a fierce belief in education and self-worth, and Vanessa excelled in school, eventually earning a law degree from one of the country's top universities. When she returned to Milridge to practice law, some thought she was making a mistake. "Why would you come back here?" her friends asked. "You could thrive anywhere else, Vanessa." But Vanessa had always felt a deep sense of responsibility to her hometown. She believed that real change had to start at home, no matter how challenging it might be. When she became the youngest and first black judge in Milridge's history, it was a moment of pride for her family and a symbol of progress for many in the community. But it also painted a target on her back for those resistant to change. Officer Nate Barnes represented a side of Milridge that Vanessa had fought against her entire life. Born and raised in a nearby town, Barnes had joined the Milridge Police Department in his early 20s, quickly earning a reputation for his aggressive tactics and unapologetic attitude. While some praised him as a by-the-book cop, others saw him as a bully in uniform, using his badge to intimidate and control. Over the years, complaints about Barnes's behavior piled up, but nothing ever seemed to stick. The system, as Vanessa knew too well, often protected its own. On that fateful day, Barnes had been assigned to patrol the affluent neighborhoods of Milridge, an area he secretly resented. To him, these streets represented a world he felt excluded from, a world of privilege he believed didn't belong to people who looked like Vanessa Carter. When he spotted her car and noticed she was a black woman driving alone, something in him snapped. It wasn't just a traffic stop to him, it was an opportunity to assert his authority, to remind someone like her of her place. For Vanessa, the events leading up to the traffic stop had been utterly routine. She had just wrapped up a speaking engagement at Milridge High School, where she had delivered a powerful message about the importance of justice and equality. The students had been captivated, their questions insightful and hopeful. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had chosen to stay in Milridge, to be a beacon of change in a town that often seemed stuck in the past. As she drove home, she thought about the students' enthusiasm and the conversations they had sparked.
It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the quiet southern town of Milridge, a place where time often felt frozen in its traditions. Judge Vanessa Carter, a well-respected and trailblazing black woman in her early 40s, was driving home from a community outreach event. She had spent the morning speaking to a group of high school students about justice, equality, and the importance of standing up for what is right. The event had been empowering, leaving her with a renewed sense of purpose as she reflected on the enthusiasm and hope in the young faces she had addressed. As she drove down a tree-lined suburban street, her mind wandered to her plans for the evening. She had promised her daughter, Mia, that they would bake cookies together, a rare moment of respite in her typically demanding schedule. She was humming along to a soft jazz tune playing on the radio when she noticed flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank slightly, but not out of fear. As a seasoned judge and a staunch believer in the law, Vanessa had nothing to hide. She dutifully pulled over to the side of the road, rolled down her window, and placed her hands on the steering wheel. The officer who approached her vehicle was a tall, stern-looking man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses. His name tag read N. Barnes. Officer Nate Barnes had been with the Milridge Police Department for over a decade, and his reputation preceded him. Among the black residents of the town, he was infamous for his harsh demeanor and a history of racially charged traffic stops. As he leaned down to speak, his tone was immediately condescending. "License and registration," he barked, without offering a greeting or explaining why she had been stopped. Vanessa, ever composed, nodded and retrieved the requested documents from her glove compartment. "Certainly, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Barnes smirked, his sunglasses glinting in the sunlight. "You failed to signal when you turned back there." Vanessa frowned slightly. She was meticulous about her driving habits, and she was almost certain she had used her turn signal. Still, she chose not to argue. "Here you go," she said, handing over her paperwork. Barnes scrutinized her documents longer than seemed necessary, muttering under his breath. Vanessa Carter, huh? This your car?" "Yes, officer, it is," she replied calmly. Barnes glanced at her again, this time with a hint of suspicion. "What's a lady like you doing in a neighborhood like this?" he asked, his tone dripping with implication. Vanessa's stomach tightened. She knew exactly what he was insinuating, but she maintained her composure. "I live here, Officer Barnes. Just a few streets down." Barnes raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her response. "Well, stay put," he said gruffly, walking back to his patrol car with her documents. Vanessa watched him in her side mirror, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if this was a routine stop or if something more sinister was at play. She noticed a couple of pedestrians slowing down to observe the interaction. The tension in the air was palpable. After what felt like an eternity, Barnes returned, his demeanor even more confrontational. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. Vanessa was taken aback. "May I ask why, officer?" Barnes leaned closer, his voice low and threatening. "You don't get to ask questions. Step out, now." A part of Vanessa wanted to comply without resistance, but another part of her, a part deeply rooted in her sense of justice, refused to be bullied. "Officer, I mean no disrespect, but I have the right to understand why I'm being asked to leave my vehicle," she said, her voice steady. Barnes's face darkened. "You're obstructing justice. If you don't step out, I'll have to arrest you." Vanessa sighed and unlocked her door. She stepped out of the car, her heart pounding. Barnes gestured for her to move to the back of the vehicle. "Put your hands on the trunk," he ordered. As she complied, she noticed a small crowd had gathered. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Vanessa realized the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about exposing a system that allowed people like Barnes to wield their authority unchecked. "What are you doing?" a voice called out from the crowd.
She smiled, imagining the stories they would tell their families that evening. But her thoughts were interrupted by the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Vanessa wasn't immediately alarmed. She had been driving cautiously and was confident she hadn't broken any traffic laws. Still, as a black woman in the South, she was all too aware of the potential dangers of even a routine interaction with the police. She took a deep breath and pulled over, her heart steady but her mind alert. The exchange with Barnes had been brief but telling. His tone, his body language, the way he scrutinized her documents, all of it carried an undercurrent of hostility. Vanessa had dealt with men like him before, both in and out of the courtroom. She recognized the type, men who wielded their authority like a weapon, men who mistook kindness for weakness. As she stood by the trunk of her car, the crowd began to gather. Milridge wasn't the kind of town where people ignored such incidents. The sight of a black woman being handcuffed by a white officer on a quiet suburban street was enough to draw attention. Some watched with quiet concern, others with open anger. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene with a mix of disbelief and outrage. Vanessa remained calm, even as Barnes tightened the handcuffs around her wrists. She knew the power of perception, the importance of maintaining her composure. Every word she spoke, every movement she made, would be scrutinized. But beneath her calm exterior, she felt a deep sense of frustration. How many times had she seen stories like this play out? How many times had she presided over cases where victims of discrimination were forced to defend their very humanity? Barnes, for his part, was growing increasingly agitated. The crowd's murmurs were getting louder, and the realization of who Vanessa was had begun to sink in. He had heard her name before, Judge Carter, the woman who had dismissed cases against protesters during the recent Black Lives Matter demonstrations, the woman who had publicly called for greater accountability in policing. But in his mind, none of that mattered. She was just another person who needed to be put in her place. What Barnes didn't realize was that his actions were setting off a chain reaction that would extend far beyond that quiet street. The videos being recorded would soon spread like wildfire, sparking outrage not just in Milridge but across the state and beyond. By the time Barnes shoved Vanessa into the back seat of his patrol car, the first clips were already being uploaded to social media, captioned with phrases like "racist cop arrests black judge" and "when will this stop?" Back at the station, Barnes was met with a mix of confusion and unease. His colleagues, many of whom respected Judge Carter, were visibly uncomfortable as he processed her arrest. Vanessa, still composed, requested to make a phone call. Barnes hesitated, but the look in her eyes told him he had no choice. Vanessa dialed her assistant, Grace, who immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, calls were being made to lawyers, community leaders, and local news outlets. Vanessa wasn't just fighting for herself, she was preparing to fight for every person who had ever been mistreated, dismissed, or dehumanized by a broken system. Meanwhile, the crowd outside the police station began to grow. News of the arrest had spread quickly, and people from all walks of life, teachers, students, activists, even local business owners, gathered to demand answers. Some carried signs, others chanted slogans, and all of them stood as a testament to the power of community. Inside, Barnes was beginning to feel the weight of his actions. The murmurs among his colleagues, the growing noise outside, the steady gaze of Vanessa Carter, all of it was chipping away at his confidence. He had thought he was in control, but now he realized he had underestimated the strength and resilience of the woman he had tried to intimidate. And Vanessa, sitting in the holding area with her hands still cuffed, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The events of the day rippled through the town of Milridge like a thunderclap. The arrest of Judge Vanessa Carter was no longer just a moment captured by a few bystanders, it had become a viral sensation. Within hours, the video of her calm defiance against Officer Nate Barnes had been shared thousands of times. People around the country were outraged, inspired, or emboldened, depending on their perspective, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary traffic stop. Back at the station, Barnes was beginning to unravel. He had returned to his desk after processing the arrest, trying to ignore the growing crowd outside the building. Their chants filtered through the walls, a steady hum of anger and unity. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, scrolling through social media on his phone. His heart sank as he saw the hashtags trending: hashtag Justice for Judge Carter, hashtag Milridge Racism, hashtag Stand with Vanessa. The videos of the arrest were damning. One clip, shot from a close angle, showed Barnes sneering as he handcuffed Vanessa. Another, taken from farther back, captured her composed demeanor as she addressed him. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she had asked, her voice calm but piercing. In the video, her words carried a weight that even the camera couldn't fully capture. Meanwhile, Vanessa sat quietly in the holding cell, her thoughts a mixture of strategy and resolve. She knew this was bigger than her. For years, she had worked to expose and dismantle the systemic injustices embedded in Milridge's institutions. She had faced resistance at every turn: police unions lobbying against her reforms, local politicians dismissing her as too idealistic, and community members too afraid to speak out. But now, the system's flaws were on full display, and the world was watching. As she waited, Grace arrived at the station with attorney Marcus Hill, one of Vanessa's closest allies and a fierce civil rights advocate. Marcus, a tall man with a commanding presence, strode into the precinct with the kind of confidence that made even seasoned officers hesitate. Grace followed closely, her phone in hand as she coordinated with media outlets and community leaders. Marcus didn't waste any time. He demanded to see Vanessa and spoke with a calm authority that left no room for negotiation. The desk sergeant, clearly uneasy, led him to the holding area, where Vanessa stood to greet him. "Judge Carter," Marcus said, his voice warm but serious, "we're going to get you out of here. But first, we need to ensure this moment creates the change we've been fighting for." Vanessa nodded. "This isn't just about me, Marcus. This is about every person in this town who's been silenced or ignored. Let's make it count." As they discussed their next steps, Barnes was summoned to the office of Chief Marlon Green. Green, a pragmatic man in his late 50s, had always walked a delicate line between supporting his officers and maintaining public trust. But today, that line had vanished. He was furious. "What the hell were you thinking, Barnes?" Green barked, slamming a folder onto his desk. The contents spilled out: printouts of the viral videos, screenshots of the trending hashtags, and a list of complaints filed against Barnes over the years. Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know who she was, Chief. She didn't tell me." "That's your excuse?" Green shot back, his face reddening. "It doesn't matter who she is. You escalated a situation that never should have happened. And now the entire department is under fire because of your stupidity." Barnes opened his mouth to respond, but Green cut him off. "Save it. You're on administrative leave effective immediately. Get out of my office." Outside, the crowd had grown to hundreds, spilling into the street and blocking traffic. The chants of "Justice for Judge Carter" and "End Police Racism Now" echoed through the air. Local news vans lined the perimeter, reporters jostling for position as community leaders addressed the gathering. At the center of the crowd, Reverend Elijah Daniels, a longtime activist and family friend of Vanessa, spoke passionately into a megaphone. "This is not just about one incident," he declared. "This is about a system that allows officers like Nate Barnes to operate with impunity. We demand accountability, and we demand it now." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. For many, this moment felt like the culmination of years of frustration and anger. The arrest of Judge Carter had become a flashpoint, galvanizing people from all walks of life to take a stand. Inside the station, Green was beginning to feel the pressure. He knew the department couldn't afford to mishandle this situation, but he also knew that any decision he made would be scrutinized. He called an emergency meeting with city officials, including Mayor Patricia Reynolds. Reynolds, a seasoned politician known for her careful, calculated demeanor, was visibly shaken. "This is a nightmare," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If we don't get ahead of this, it could destroy the town's reputation." Green nodded. "We need to release Judge Carter immediately and issue a public statement. But we also need to take a hard look at our policies and address the underlying issues." Reynolds sighed. "Fine. But this isn't just about one officer or one policy. This is about systemic change, and that's going to require more than a statement." As the meeting continued, Vanessa was finally released from her holding cell. Marcus and Grace escorted her out of the station, where the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of her. Vanessa raised her hand, signaling for quiet, and stepped forward to address the gathering. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for standing with me, for standing with all of us who believe in justice and equality. Today was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a system that needs to change. And together, we will make that change." Her words ignited the crowd, their cheers ringing out into the night. But as Vanessa looked out over the sea of faces, she knew the fight was far from over. The events of the day had set the stage, but the real battle was just beginning. It was a battle for accountability, for reform, and for the soul of Milridge itself. And Vanessa was ready to lead it. The events surrounding Judge Vanessa Carter's arrest had set off a whirlwind that swept through Milridge with unrelenting force. By the following morning, the town was unrecognizable. The streets near the courthouse were crowded with protesters carrying signs demanding justice, local businesses displayed banners of solidarity, and the courthouse steps had become a makeshift podium for speakers from various activist groups. But behind the public outcry, powerful undercurrents were at play. The legal system and local government, shaken by the scrutiny, scrambled to contain the damage while simultaneously deflecting blame. Meetings were called, statements were drafted, and alliances were tested. For many, it was a moment of reckoning that could no longer be avoided. Judge Vanessa Carter, though released from custody, had no time to rest. Her home became a hub of activity, with her legal team, community leaders, and trusted friends coming together to strategize. Vanessa sat at the head of her dining table, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions she felt inside. "We need to push for immediate policy changes," she said, her voice steady. "Not just an investigation into Barnes, but a comprehensive review of the department's practices. This is our chance to demand real accountability." Marcus Hill, her attorney and longtime ally, nodded. "Agreed. But we need to be strategic. The department will try to protect itself, and the town's leadership will prioritize damage control over actual reform." Grace chimed in, her phone buzzing with updates. "The videos have reached over 1 million views overnight. National media is picking up the story. This isn't just a local issue anymore, it's a symbol of something much bigger." Vanessa leaned back, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person who's been silenced, mistreated, or ignored. We need to make sure their voices are heard too." Meanwhile, across town, Officer Nate Barnes sat in his modest apartment, grappling with the fallout of his actions. The previous day's arrogance had been replaced by a gnawing sense of fear and uncertainty. His suspension had been swift, and his name was now synonymous with the very issues he had dismissed as overblown. Barnes scrolled through his phone, each notification a fresh reminder of his disgrace. News articles dissected his history, social media posts condemned him, and even former colleagues had distanced themselves. For the first time, he felt the weight of accountability, and it was suffocating. But Barnes wasn't the only one feeling the heat. Police Chief Marlon Green was under immense pressure from all sides. Community leaders demanded transparency, activists called for his resignation, and the mayor insisted on a swift resolution. Green, a veteran of the force who had seen his fair share of crises, knew this one was different. He called an emergency meeting with his senior officers, hoping to salvage the department's reputation. "We need to address this head-on," he said, his voice firm. "An independent investigation into Barnes's actions has already been initiated, but that's just the beginning. We need to rebuild trust with the community." One officer, visibly uneasy, spoke up. "With all due respect, Chief, trust isn't going to be rebuilt overnight. People are angry, and for good reason. We need to show them that we're serious about change." The room fell silent as Green considered the words. For years, he had balanced the demands of his officers with the expectations of the community. But now, that balance was tipping, and he realized there was no going back. Outside the station, the protest had swelled into the hundreds. Reverend Elijah Daniels once again took to the megaphone, his booming voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he declared. "This is about a system that has failed us for far too long. We demand a seat at the table, because we will no longer accept being ignored." As the Reverend spoke, Vanessa arrived, flanked by Marcus and Grace. The crowd erupted into cheers as she approached the podium. She paused, taking in the sight of so many people standing together in solidarity. "Thank you," she began, her voice resonating with conviction. "Thank you for showing up, for speaking out, for refusing to be silenced. What happened to me is just one example of a larger problem, a problem we've all seen, felt, and lived. But today, we're here to say that enough is enough." The crowd roared its approval, their energy electrifying the air. Vanessa continued, her words measured but powerful. "Change doesn't come easily. It requires courage, persistence, and unity. But together, we have the power to create a system that serves everyone, not just the privileged few. So let's keep pushing, let's keep fighting, and let's make sure our voices are heard." As she stepped down, Marcus leaned in. "That was powerful," he said. "But we need to turn this momentum into concrete action. The department and the town's leadership are already on the defensive, but they'll only move if we force their hand." Vanessa nodded. "Then we start by demanding a public forum. Let's bring the town together, citizens, officials, law enforcement. Let them see the faces of the people they've been ignoring. And let's make it clear that we won't back down." The plan quickly took shape. Over the next few days, Vanessa and her team worked tirelessly to organize the forum, rallying support from local organizations, churches, and even businesses. Flyers were distributed, social media campaigns launched, and volunteers mobilized. As the day of the forum approached, the tension in Milridge was palpable. The town had become a focal point for national discussions on race, justice, and accountability. News crews set up outside the courthouse, eager to capture the next chapter of the unfolding drama. Inside the courthouse, where the forum was set to take place, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Rows of chairs filled quickly as residents, reporters, and community leaders took their seats. At the front of the room, a long table was set up for the panel, which included Vanessa, Chief Green, Mayor Reynolds, and other key figures. When the forum began, the air was thick with emotion. Speaker after speaker shared their stories, their voices trembling with a mixture of anger, pain, and hope. An elderly man recounted his experiences of segregation, a young woman spoke of being profiled, and a mother tearfully described her fear for her teenage son. As Vanessa listened, her resolve deepened. This wasn't just about policy changes or disciplinary actions. It was about addressing the deep wounds that had festered in Milridge for generations. When her turn came to speak, she rose with a sense of purpose. "We've heard the pain, the frustration, and the hope in this room," she said, her voice steady. "Now it's time for action. We demand a citizen oversight board to hold the police accountable. We demand bias training for officers. We demand transparency in investigations. And we demand that Milridge becomes a place where justice is not a privilege but a right for all." The room erupted into applause, the sound a testament to the unity and determination that had taken root in the town. For Vanessa, it was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the work that lay ahead. The battle for justice was far from over, but she knew that together, they could reshape the future of Milridge, and perhaps, inspire change far beyond its borders. The public forum in Milridge had become the cornerstone of a movement that rippled far beyond the town's borders. By the time the last speaker stepped down, it was clear that the people of Milridge were no longer content to be silent observers of injustice. They were now a collective force, demanding change from a system that had long failed them. Judge Vanessa Carter emerged as the unofficial leader of this movement, her calm resolve and eloquent words galvanizing a community ready to fight for its dignity. But the momentum came with challenges. As the days passed, the pushback from those resistant to change grew more aggressive. Online smear campaigns targeted Vanessa, accusing her of exploiting the incident for personal gain. Anonymous threats arrived at her doorstep, scrawled on notes left under her windshield wiper. Old political adversaries resurfaced, questioning her qualifications and motives in thinly veiled media interviews. Each attack was calculated to discredit her and weaken the movement she now represented. Yet Vanessa, strengthened by years of battling systemic resistance, refused to falter. She knew that the backlash was not a sign of failure but of progress. The systems entrenched in power were trembling, and their defenders were desperate. She turned each attack into an opportunity to highlight the very injustices she sought to address, using her platform to emphasize the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. One particularly egregious attempt to discredit Vanessa came from an influential local businessman, Richard Alton, who had ties to both the police union and the town's political elite. Alton funded a series of editorials in the local newspaper, claiming that Vanessa's arrest was a staged event to boost her political ambitions. The articles were filled with innuendos and misleading information, designed to cast doubt on her integrity. Marcus Hill, Vanessa's steadfast attorney and friend, confronted her with the news in her office late one evening. "They're getting bolder," he said, placing the newspaper on her desk. "They're banking on public fatigue. They think if they muddy the waters enough, people will lose focus." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the article. "Let them try," she said, her tone unshaken. "Their desperation is proof that we're winning. But we need to counter this with facts. Let's organize a press conference. We'll present evidence not just about what happened to me, but about the broader patterns of misconduct and bias in this town." The press conference, held a week later, was a masterstroke. Vanessa stood before a crowd of reporters, flanked by Marcus and a diverse group of community leaders. She methodically dismantled the allegations against her, presenting records, timelines, and eyewitness testimonies that left no room for doubt. More importantly, she shifted the focus back to the systemic issues, unveiling a report compiled by local activists that detailed years of racial profiling, unjust arrests, and ignored complaints against the police department. "This isn't just about one incident," Vanessa said, her voice steady and commanding. "This is about a pattern. A culture. And it's about time we confronted it head-on. Milridge deserves better. Our children deserve better." The report and her speech sent shockwaves through the town and beyond. National media outlets picked up the story, drawing even more attention to Milridge's struggles and the movement led by Vanessa. Activists from neighboring towns began organizing their own protests and forums, inspired by the courage and determination of Milridge's citizens. As the movement grew, Chief Marlon Green found himself at a crossroads. Privately, he had always recognized the flaws in his department, but years of institutional inertia and political pressure had kept him from taking meaningful action. Now, with the eyes of the nation on Milridge, he knew he couldn't remain passive any longer. In a surprising move, Green reached out to Vanessa directly. He requested a meeting, not as adversaries, but as collaborators. Vanessa was skeptical but agreed, knowing that any opportunity to push for real reform was worth exploring. They met in a neutral space, a community center that had become a hub for activists and volunteers. "I'll be honest with you, Judge Carter," Green began, his voice heavy with weariness. "I've spent my entire career walking a fine line, trying to keep the peace while navigating the politics of this town. But what happened with Barnes, and everything that's come to light since, has forced me to see things differently. I want to help fix this, but I need your help to do it." Vanessa studied him carefully. "If you're serious about reform, Chief, then you need to be prepared to face resistance from your own ranks. Change won't come without a fight." "I know," Green replied. "But I'd rather fight for what's right than continue pretending everything is fine. I'm ready to start with the recommendations from your report. Citizen oversight, implicit bias training, transparency in disciplinary actions. Let's make it happen." Their partnership was an unlikely one, but it sent a powerful message to the community. Change was possible when leaders chose courage over comfort. Together, Vanessa and Green began laying the groundwork for a new era in Milridge. They held joint town halls, inviting citizens to voice their concerns and participate in shaping the reforms. They pushed for state-level support to fund training programs and technology upgrades for the department. They even worked to establish a scholarship fund for young people from underrepresented communities to pursue careers in law enforcement and criminal justice. But the road ahead was far from smooth. Within the police department, a faction of officers resisted the changes, viewing them as an attack on their profession. Barnes, though suspended, became a rallying figure for this group, feeding into their grievances and stoking their fears. Vanessa knew that the fight for reform was as much about changing hearts and minds as it was about implementing policies. As the weeks turned into months, small but significant victories began to emerge. Complaints against officers were handled more transparently, leading to a noticeable increase in public trust. Recruitment efforts brought in a more diverse group of candidates, signaling a shift in the department's culture. And in the courtroom, Vanessa continued her work as a judge, her decisions now carrying even greater weight as a symbol of justice and accountability. Milridge was transforming, slowly but surely. And while Vanessa knew the journey was far from over, she found strength in the community that had risen to stand beside her. The movement they had built together was no longer just about her arrest, it was about reclaiming their town, their dignity, and their future. And as she looked out over a packed town hall meeting one evening, filled with faces of every age, race, and background, she knew they were on the right path. Together, they were proving that even in the face of injustice, hope and determination could prevail. Months after the initial incident, Milridge had become a national symbol of resilience and transformation. Judge Vanessa Carter's arrest, once a spark of outrage, had ignited a flame that burned steadily, illuminating the cracks in a deeply flawed system. The town was no longer defined by its divisions but by the courage of its citizens to confront uncomfortable truths and demand better. Yet the journey toward true justice was ongoing, and the final chapter of this saga was still being written. For Vanessa, the fight had shifted from the courtroom to the broader battleground of public policy and community activism. She spent her days presiding over cases, her rulings reflecting a deeper commitment to fairness and equity, and her evenings meeting with community leaders, activists, and even state officials to push for legislative reforms. She had become a bridge between the people and the institutions that governed them, a role she embraced with both humility and determination. The Citizen Oversight Board, one of the first victories of the movement, had become a cornerstone of the reforms. Comprised of a diverse group of residents, legal experts, and even retired law enforcement officers, the board reviewed cases of misconduct, ensuring transparency and accountability. Its first major case was, unsurprisingly, that of Officer Nate Barnes. The investigation into his actions revealed not only his blatant abuse of power during Vanessa's arrest but also a troubling pattern of discriminatory practices spanning years. The findings led to his termination and the revocation of his law enforcement certification. While Barnes's dismissal was a victory for the movement, it also highlighted the depth of the problem. His behavior was not an anomaly but a symptom of a larger cultural issue within the department. This realization drove Vanessa and Police Chief Marlon Green to intensify their efforts. Together, they spearheaded an initiative to overhaul recruitment practices, ensuring that future officers reflected the values and diversity of the community they served. Training programs were implemented to address implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement, marking a stark departure from the old ways. But the reforms were not without resistance. A faction within the police department, emboldened by national rhetoric against defunding the police and claims of victimization, worked to undermine the changes. These officers, though a minority, were vocal and disruptive, spreading fear and misinformation both within the department and in the community. Anonymous letters criticizing the oversight board and Vanessa's leadership began circulating, and tension simmered beneath the surface. Vanessa and Green addressed these challenges head-on. They held regular town hall meetings, inviting citizens to ask questions and express their concerns. These forums were often heated, with skeptical residents voicing fears about crime and safety, while others demanded even more radical changes. Vanessa's calm, measured responses and Green's willingness to acknowledge past failures slowly began to bridge the divides. Over time, the once hostile dialogue turned into constructive conversations, and trust, though fragile, started to take root. One of the most poignant moments in this journey came when Vanessa received a letter from a young boy named Jamal. The letter, written in painstakingly neat handwriting, read, "Dear Judge Carter, my mom told me about what you did and how you stood up to that cop. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. Thank you for helping make our town better." The letter brought tears to Vanessa's eyes and renewed her resolve. She reached out to Jamal's family, inviting them to one of the community workshops she was organizing. The workshop, aimed at educating young people about their rights and responsibilities, became a platform for empowerment. Seeing the next generation engaged and inspired reminded Vanessa why the fight was worth every sleepless night and every attack on her character. Meanwhile, the national attention on Milridge brought opportunities and challenges. Activists from across the country visited to learn from the town's progress, while journalists documented the changes and the lingering struggles. Vanessa was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and even a congressional hearing on police reform. Each platform gave her a chance to amplify Milridge's story and advocate for systemic change beyond the town's borders. But with the spotlight came scrutiny. Critics accused Vanessa of seeking fame, of using her position to further her own agenda. Some questioned whether the changes in Milridge were sustainable or merely symbolic. Vanessa, ever composed, responded with actions rather than words. She continued to work tirelessly, knowing that true change was measured not in headlines but in the lives improved and the injustices undone. The turning point came when Milridge hosted a regional summit on community policing and justice reform. Delegates from neighboring towns, state officials, and national activists gathered to share ideas, strategies, and stories. Vanessa, Green, and Reverend Elijah Daniels co-chaired the event, presenting Milridge's journey as a case study. The summit was a resounding success, with participants leaving inspired and equipped to initiate change in their own communities. As the movement grew, so did the personal sacrifices. Vanessa's once quiet life had been replaced by a relentless schedule of work and activism. She faced moments of doubt and exhaustion, wondering if the progress was worth the cost. But every time she looked out at the faces of those who had joined the fight, people of all backgrounds united by a shared vision of justice, she found her answer. In the midst of these challenges, an unexpected ally emerged, Richard Alton, the businessman who had once sought to discredit Vanessa. After witnessing the tangible improvements in the town and hearing firsthand from employees affected by the reforms, Alton publicly apologized and pledged funding for youth programs and community initiatives. His gesture, though met with skepticism, signaled a shift in the broader narrative. Even the staunchest critics were beginning to see the value of change. By the end of the year, Milridge was a different town. It was far from perfect, but it was undeniably better. Crime rates had decreased, not because of harsher policing but because of stronger community ties and proactive engagement. Relationships between the police and residents, while still a work in progress, had improved significantly. And most importantly, the people of Milridge had reclaimed their voice and their power. Vanessa stood on the steps of the courthouse one chilly evening, looking out at the town she loved. The square was lit with holiday decorations, and families strolled through, their laughter mingling with the crisp winter air. It was a scene that spoke of hope, resilience, and the strength of a community that had refused to be broken. As she turned to leave, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand. "Judge Carter," he asked, "do you think Milridge's story will inspire other towns to follow suit?" Vanessa smiled, her breath visible in the cold. "I hope so," she said. "But more importantly, I hope it reminds people that change starts with ordinary individuals standing up for what's right. Milridge isn't special because of me, it's special because of the people who refuse to stay silent. And that's something any town can achieve." With that, she walked away, her steps firm and purposeful. The story of Milridge was far from over, but for Vanessa Carter, it was a reminder of what could happen when justice met courage and a community chose to rise together.